Lieutenant General Shavindra Silva, officers of the three forces, and guests who are participating in the Colombo Defense Seminar 2019, and my dear friends, those in the academia, those in the media, and other areas related. Let me at the outset extend a warm congratulations to the Sri Lanka Army, which has conceptualized and organized this annual Colombo Defense Seminar for the 9th consecutive year. This seminar has become an internationally recognized forum for intellectual exchange and discussion on issues of contemporary relevance, particularly related to strategic issues and security, nationally, regionally, and internationally. I'm honored to have been invited to deliver the valedictory address this year to this gathering, which comprises eminent practitioners and scholars from 40 friendly countries, as well as prominent defense policy planners, practitioners, and analysts within Sri Lanka. As I am addressing this gathering at a time where there is a change of command in the Sri Lanka Army, I wish to acknowledge former Commander General Mahesh Senanayake, who invited me to deliver this address, while also wishing the incumbent Lieutenant General Shavindra Silva all success in his new tenure. Over the past 2 days, you have together deliberated on some of the most challenging contemporary issues faced by the international security community. Under the theme, Evolving Military Excellence in the contemporary security landscape. The Army Commander, in his welcome address yesterday, emphasized that the Colombo Defense Seminar was designed to share Sri Lanka's experiences, not necessarily the successes, but also the debacles endured. No doubt these critical discussions have contributed towards formulating a collective and assertive approach to repel security threats to all our nations. Many people think that a valedictory address is a graduation speech given by a kid who got the highest marks in school, and often it is. But valedictory words don't have to be anything to do with schools or grades or throwing your cap in the air. In the context of this seminar, I intend to fulfill the meaning of the valedictory speech in giving some insights from my vantage point, which I hope would be of useful food for thought through gleaning from the thoughts which have come out from this seminar as we go our ways and make better informed decisions. As for the focus of my speech today, I think it would be fair to say that this year's Colombo Defense Seminar, taking place as it does in the backdrop of the Easter Sunday terror attacks, where the attackers claimed allegiance to the Islamic State and were at a minimum inspired by them, the causes that precipitated the attacks, Sri Lanka's reaction to it, the world's response, and possible continuing vulnerabilities have dominated conversations both within and outside this seminar. Given that the recovery over the past 4 years has demanded a stronger than ever before whole of government approach, one in which the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially through its International Security and Counterterrorism Division established at the beginning of this year, has been integrally involved, I intend to focus my comments this afternoon from a civilian perspective on the lessons learned in dealing with the challenges that Sri Lanka has faced in the past 4 months and where we go from here. As I do so, I am deeply conscious that while this is essentially a case study of contemporary Sri Lanka, there are lessons from it to be drawn by all countries vulnerable to such threats. In approaching the response of the aftermath of these horrific attacks, viewing it from where I sit, From a foreign policy perspective, I do so within the framework largely set by the UNGA resolution of December 2002 on protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, as well as the UNGA resolutions of December 2001 and UN Human Rights Council resolution of April 2002 on human rights and terrorism. As you are aware, post 9/11, many states were thrust into a myriad complex challenges of countering terrorism, a phenomena Sri Lanka and a few other countries across the world had previously experienced firsthand for many long years. Despite the fast developing understanding of the field from then on, terrorism continues to elude a comprehensive and readily agreed treaty definition under international law, even as it continues to pose devastating human cost worldwide, as well as destabilize governments and undermine economic and social development. Terrorists' choice of targets, methods of financing, and inspiration for attack have been constantly evolving. In response to this complex, growing threat of terrorism, the international community over the years has developed a common universal legal framework, which comprises 19 international legal instruments strengthened by relevant UN Security Council resolutions. This framework confers a general obligation on states to ensure right to life and security of their citizens and recognize the necessary and sufficient conditions to activate the threshold of emergency in the fight of terrorism, subject to the requirements of legality, proportionality, and non-discrimination. Equally relevant in this context is the UN framework on countering violent extremism, reinforced by the Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism presented by the UN Secretary General in January 2016, where states are called to adopt a comprehensive approach encompassing not only security-based counterterrorism measures, but also preventive measures to address the conditions that drive individuals to radicalize and join extremist groups. This plan of action also calls out for a holistic approach grounded in human rights in the efforts to prevent violent extremism. Growing global consensus in the fight against terrorism and violent extremism is also reflected in the UNGA resolution adopted by consensus in 2016 in the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review. However, as actors immersed in this field, I'm sure we are all acutely conscious that despite the best efforts, the very delicate balance between fighting terrorism and protecting human rights has been elusive, often veering towards one extreme or the other, applying double standards to similar situations and often politicizing these issues, which result in not only failing to address pressing issues, but in fact acting in a manner that is counterproductive to our respective national interests. I strongly believe that we must do both, fight terrorism and protect human rights, and not sacrifice one at the altar of the other. It is in this context that the recent tragedy on Easter Sunday was a litmus test for Sri Lanka's resolve to apply human rights and humanitarian law, and especially a test of strengths and shortcomings of our democratic institutions that have been strengthened in recent years. As for the security response and community engagement in the aftermath of 21/4, we have witnessed the reconfirmation of the strength of law enforcement and security apparatus of Sri Lanka to secure the country and prevent any further attacks. We have done so while allowing for the mourning and coming to terms with our loss and embarking on the rebuilding and recovery process necessary after such horrific attacks on a citizenry. The speedy and effective restoration of security has been central to ensuring that the impact on the country, politically, economically, socially, and in terms of international reputation was lessened. This security response would not have been possible without the assistance of the Sri Lankan community at large. The resilience of the social trust within Sri Lanka, despite the attempts of terrorists to destroy the social fabric of the country, was evident in the aftermath of the attacks. It speaks to the enduring link built in the past between our communities and law enforcement authorities, that communities themselves were coming forward to warn of the dangers to society. This is not to be lightly overlooked or taken for granted. It must be maintained and nourished with continued good faith engagement. The swift imposition of the state of emergency, the temporary suspension of social media to arrest escalation of the situation and mitigate the ability of mischief makers to destabilize society at a vulnerable juncture, and the reoperationalization of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which had been held in abeyance for a while, were the main tools deployed by the Sri Lankan state in the course of swiftly restoring normalcy in the immediate aftermath of 21/4. It is to Sri Lanka's credit that as of this month, the emergency has been lifted. The suspension of social media was very short-lived and strategic and has had the spillover effect of forcing some of these platforms to pay greater attention to vernacular language-based communication, which I hope is to the benefit of many other countries as well. The quest to get the counterterrorism legislation right has become both more informed and urgent. Within Parliamentary Oversight Committee on International Relations, where it is presently being referred to by the Parliament, it is being studied with officials from the Foreign Affairs, Defence, Law and Order, Justice, the Attorney General's Department, and other relevant branches of government. All these acts bear testimony to the practical relevance of the need to balance security and freedoms, where the tools at the disposal of governments and law enforcement authorities to ensure security, as exercised by all governments of the world, is tempered with our sense of protecting the rights of the citizenry and allowing them to benefit from a secured country. A second aspect I'd like to focus on is arrest and detention. And here again, in the immediate aftermath and ongoing efforts to restore a sense of security of citizens at large, persons suspected or revealed to have connections with the Easter Sunday attackers were detained and arrested. Full access to these individuals in detention by the ICRC was guaranteed, and any complaints regarding detentions or any reports of mistreatment were immediately directed to the Sri Lanka Human Rights Commission, who have already launched investigations and issued guidelines. In this manner, the effective neutralizing of terrorist threats by prompt action by the intelligence and law enforcement authorities has been also balanced by independent human rights mechanisms. This speaks of a robust, healthy system that works in tandem to the checks and balances each other brings towards the betterment of society. A further aspect has been the legislative response that conforms to international standards. These attacks has also brought into the fore the collaboration between the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defence and the Attorney General's Department in the security sphere. In previous collaborative attempts, the ministries had, by way of regulations, one of 2012 under the United Nations Act of 68, enacted legislation to give effect to UNSCR 1373 on terrorist financing and asset freezing, 1267 sanctions covering Al-Qaeda and Taliban, and 2252 sanction framework to include the Islamic State. In the aftermath of the attacks, the authorities coordinated legislative measures to list the three groups, NTJ, the JMI, and the WAS, which were revealed to have been instrumental in the Easter Sunday attacks under UNSCR 1373 on terrorist financing. In addition to the list of these entities, the Ministry's action is being taken under the same regulation to identify and designate individuals affiliated with the proscribed organizations with a view to freezing their assets and preventing terrorist financing. Amendments have also been made to regulations related to UNSCR 1267 and 1373 to expand the regulations to include provisions to request foreign states to designate individuals and groups suspected of being involved in terrorist activities and widen the coverage of freezing orders. The Foreign Ministry is also working on legislative measures on foreign terrorist financiers as a priority, together with the Attorney General's Department and other relevant agencies. In this context, it is imperative to promulgate domestic regulations to give effect to UN Security Council Resolution 2178 pertaining to, of 2014 pertaining to foreign terrorist fighters that will address the issue of Sri Lankan nationals traveling to join ISIS, fighters returning from conflict zones in the world, and prevent Sri Lanka from being used as a transit point for foreign terrorist fighters. As previously noted, the relevant authorities are also coordinating on reviewing the counterterrorism legislation in view of the attacks through the prism of new aspects of terrorism revealed by these attacks, including the abuse of social media. Community standards localized to suit the needs of the centuries-long Sri Lankan multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual context must also be set when it comes to engaging with social media giants of the world to ensure the protection of peace and stability among communities. Aspects of hate speech, dealing with fake news, disinformation that incites violence are vital components of reviewing standards of engagement online. This would allow these platforms to continue without interruption to be positive, vital drivers of information dissemination and economic growth, including supporting entrepreneurship in startups, the SME sector, and online economic endeavors without endangering security. A fourth aspect was the administrative responses during the crisis. In the immediate aftershock of the terrorist attacks, for instance, the government took action to ban the full face covering clothing or accessories under Public Security Ordinance. However, in deference to the sensitivities and requests of the Muslim community, clarifications were issued very quickly on the use of the types of religious clothing, and this demonstrated the self-reflective, self-critical, and constructive engagement of the government even in the conduct of its security measures. A further area was addressing the lacuna of knowledge and international collaborations. As you are well aware, while violent extremist movements and terrorist attacks are not a new phenomenon in Sri Lanka, the violent extremist threats we face at present have evolved over time and morphed through forces of globalization, monumental expansion of means of communication, high-tech financial conduits, and fed by global tensions and conflicts. All countries and international organizations are struggling to mitigate the threat to security imposed by these insidious actors. Collective international action in addressing these challenges is paramount, given the borderless nature of challenges we confront. In his inaugural address yesterday, Secretary of Defense General Shanta Kotegoda called for a global joint strategy to combat terrorism and violent extremism, insisting that developing countries need special assistance and support to upgrade their capacities to combat radicalization and extremist organizations. Identifying the need to support the country's security apparatus, the Foreign Ministry has coordinated closely with multilateral and bilateral partners who have the capacity and expressed a wish to assist Sri Lanka in addressing this global threat. International and regional organizations, including the UN Counterterrorism Directorate and the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator, is working closely with the country to assist in the development of capacity and knowledge. The assistance we have sought is for tangible measures to enrich, support and expand the work already undertaken by Sri Lanka's authorities working in this regard. Additionally, and even more crucially, of course, many of you in uniform are aware of the considerable extent of cooperation that has been both ongoing and stepped up since 2014 between Sri Lankan defense, intelligence, criminal investigative and criminal justice agencies with their respective counterparts from friendly countries and global and regional police organizations across the world. The government of Sri Lanka has also participated in international conferences, seminars and workshops and training on counterterrorism and related subjects in the past several months in order to learn from the best practices in law enforcement, community engagement, PVE and CVE relevant legislation policy from countries that have been facing this new phase of terrorism over the past decade. Close coordination among relevant divisions of ministries and agencies has avoided the duplication of these efforts and make sure that our efforts are integrated and are targeted at resolving the problem in the fastest possible time. As we move into shared understandings on these issues, intelligence cooperation is of vital importance, and I'm sure that has been a subject which has been discussed in the previous sessions, and I do not intend to dwell in that matter. Another important area which I would call works in progress are threefold: securing borders, internet and social media, and de-radicalization and prevention of violent extremism measures. As for securing borders, with a view to better securing Sri Lanka's borders, the relevant local agencies of the National Border Management Committee is garnering the required international support in the need to implement the Sri Lanka Integrated Border Management Strategy 2018-2021, approved by the Cabinet of Ministers in July 2018. Of special mention is the API PNR system in order to secure Sri Lanka's borders from being breached by those traveling for ill-founded purposes, be it terrorism, narcotics, human smuggling, or any other nefarious activity. These mechanisms will be in line with the international standards set to secure the safety of travelers globally, making it more difficult for terrorists to abuse freedoms and safety of global citizens at large. As for internet and social media, given that the propagation of violent extremist and terrorist ideologies, knowledge of terrorist tactics, weaponry and technology, aggrandizing of terrorist activities, as well as recruitment of vulnerable sections of society, including youth, through the internet and social media are ever-increasing global threats that defy physical borders, global and collective action is required to address these grave concerns. Understanding that Sri Lanka alone cannot curb the abuse of internet by terrorists for inciting violence, Sri Lanka has expressed its desire to join global initiatives such as the Christchurch Call of Action spearheaded by France and New Zealand, where governments and tech companies undertake voluntary obligations in the use of internet and the social media platforms. And finally, on de-radicalization and the prevention of violent extremist measures. While efforts can be made to curb the terrorist use and abuse of internet and social media platforms, and legislative measures and law enforcement mechanisms may be put in place to counter radical ideologies leading to violent extremism, it has been made clear through the decades that a community-based approach is required for sustainability of these efforts. In this context, It is necessary to develop the critical thinking capacity of youth, strengthen community bonds, sense of civic duty, and build community resilience to mitigate the effects and influences of violent extremist ideology leading to terrorism that may escape the ever-watchful eye of law enforcement authorities. The role of the community and their resilience against the local drivers of extremism are essential in preventing violent extremism. Sri Lanka takes justifiable pride in its successful rehabilitation program for over 12,000 LTT cadres following the end of the conflict, which has been lauded internationally, including by the United Nations. The key to its success is the reintegration into society of the rehabilitated cadres, where they resume a normal life within the community and have not returned to violence. However, radicalization due to religious ideology is a new, complex, and extremely sensitive phenomenon and requires a whole-of-society approach. In this context, the Foreign Ministry has taken the initiative to seek the assistance and support for Sri Lanka's own national plans and goals of preventing violent extremism. The visit of Dr. Khalid Kosher, Executive Director of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, in this context is both timely and significant, and we can draw from his expertise and experience in working in several countries as we chart our way forward in drawing up measures on how to address this issue. I want to recognize the presence of Dr. Kosher, who is here today, and I want to thank him, together with our partners from the Defense Ministry, the Tri-Services, and all the other ministries which have had interactions with him over this week, and we look forward to working with him in resolving or getting close to resolving this matter. Efforts in this regard must be extremely sensitive to the context specificity of issues and therefore its solutions. It is imperative to avoid broad brushstrokes in identifying the needs of communities in different countries with their own unique histories and context. Finally, on these areas which to come to the setbacks to the economy and how Sri Lanka has confronted in dealing with this problem. To avoid broad brushstrokes in identifying the needs of communities in different countries with their own unique history. Overcoming setbacks to the economy in the wake of the terrorist attacks on 21/4 has been a greater challenge. In the immediate aftermath, in addition to the general concern of security, which however were fast overcome, the travel advisories imposed by some countries that lingered on possibly a few weeks too long created an exacerbated negative impact that was a clear drawback to the economy. However, Sri Lanka, as it did throughout the 30-year struggle against the LTT terrorism, has shown its characteristic resistance, and despite the initial plunge in the tourism, export and investor sectors, has rebounded. The good news is that 4 months later, the economy is rebouncing, with Russia this week agreeing to the relaxation of its travel advisory. All significant tourist sourcing countries have enabled their citizens to visit Sri Lanka. This development amply showcases the trust placed by the international community on the capability of the Sri Lankan government in maintaining safety and security of the country, with able and skilled security forces deployed to protect its interests and citizens and of its visitors. Initiatives taken by key government stakeholders and the private sector in image rebuilding has yielded positive results. According to the chairman of the Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority, Jayaratna, the number of tourist arrivals during the first 7 months recorded a drop of 18.7% to 1.12 million compared to 1.38 million in the same period last year. In April, soon after the Easter attacks, while tourist officials had estimated a 1.5 billion revenue loss this year, while projecting a 30% drop in arrivals, revising the estimates on volumes and earnings, the authorities' current projection for 2019 expects a decline of approximately only 10% in tourist arrivals from the original estimate of 30%, while the projected dip in earnings will be 20%. The solidarity shown by friendly nations such as India, with the visit of the Honorable Prime Minister, His Excellency Narendra Modi, on 9th June 2019, less than 6 weeks after the attacks, demonstrated to the world that Sri Lanka is back on track and is a safe place to travel. It would be amiss not to mention some of the international accolades from Lonely Planet Travel Plus Leisure magazine, which re-ranked Sri Lanka as the most desirable tourist destination and #1 island to visit in 2019, even after the horrific terrorist attacks, which added strength and encouragement to the promotional campaigns after which has strengthened and added encouragement to our own campaigns. As I speak today, the Dawoodi Bohra community's Ashra Mubarak is being held in Sri Lanka with the participation of nearly 21,000 visitors from 40 countries. I am informed that approximately 3,000 rooms in 100 hotels and 200 apartments have been occupied. Such events being hosted in Sri Lanka consolidates the confidence placed on Sri Lanka and its security forces by the world that it is a safe place to travel, do business and invest in. In respect of our economic relations, exports have continued to grow despite the Easter bombings, attributed mainly to the reputation and assurance that Sri Lankan businesses have been a reliable partner in global supply chains. According to data from the Export Development Board, in April 2019, export figures saw an increase of 0.6% from 2018. In May, an increase of 5.2% from 2018, and in June, an increase of 6.7% from 2018. In terms of investments, according to the Board of Investment of Sri Lanka, since Easter Sunday attacks to date, the Board of Investment has received 33 applications for new projects and expressions amounting to US dollars 184 million, out of which 63.14 is foreign capital, mostly in the manufacturing sector. Further, since the attacks, Sri Lanka has managed to sign 31 agreements for new investments and expansions, out of which 11 are on manufacturing and 4 on tourism. The total value of agreed investments within this period is estimated as 252 million, of which 90 million of the total investment is foreign investment. Overall, as stated at a news conference held yesterday by Finance Minister Mangala Samaravira and State Minister of Finance Eran Wickramaratne, the economic recovery has exceeded expectations when compared with countries that were placed in similar circumstances and took considerably more time to rebound. It is good to know that notwithstanding all we have been through, according to the ministers, Sri Lanka will grow by about 3.2% in 2019. All these figures show one thing, that is, that Sri Lanka took a serious hit, but that we were and we are resilient. It is in that context that we should, in this exercise where we seek to evolve military excellence in facing the challenges posed by the contemporary security landscape of Sri Lanka and the world at large, Sri Lanka's security outlook requires a radical reorientation in the context of the Easter Sunday attacks. The vulnerabilities that come from being strategically located realities of globalization and technological advancements which force us to look at security through a borderless prism, and the challenge of tackling terrorists who are equal, if not more adept, and have the means of using new technologies to achieve their ends, are challenges that require non-traditional methods. No longer can governments look at security issues, whether countering terrorism, transnational crime, or the threat of regional and international security in isolation. Inter- and intra-regional cooperation is key to successfully addressing the new threats to security, while close coordination is a must, not only between defense and foreign affairs authorities, but also home affairs, finance, aviation, shipping, legal, justice, and many other agencies related in government, given that the threat is both local and global. This is a truism, I believe, which will apply to Sri Lanka, as it probably will to most of the countries you represent here and beyond. And I hope that Sri Lanka's experience gives you both an understanding as well as the expectation and confidence that these problems can be overcome with the correct interventions, both by state and non-state actors. I thank you.